How Africa was stolen in one session, the Berlin Conference. Imagine 14 men sitting around a table in Berlin, casually drawing lines on a map and deciding the fate of an entire continent. No Africans were invited, no African voices were heard. Yet in just 4 months, these European diplomats would reshape Africa forever, creating borders that still exist today, and setting the stage for over a century of exploitation. This is the story of how Africa was literally stolen in a single conference room, and why the consequences are still tearing the continent apart today. Let's start with what Africa actually looked like before Europeans decided to civilize it. This wasn't some primitive wilderness waiting to be discovered. Africa was home to sophisticated civilizations that had been thriving for millennia. The Sahara Desert, while massive, wasn't the impenetrable barrier many imagine. For centuries, Arab traders had maintained extensive trade networks across the desert, connecting the Mediterranean world with the great West African empires. The Ghana Empire controlled gold and salt trade routes as early as the 6th century. The Mali Empire, famous for Emperor Mansa Musa's legendary wealth, dominated West Africa for centuries. These weren't small tribal kingdoms. They were vast, organized states with complex political systems, standing armies, and international trade relationships. In the south, the Congo Kingdom had established diplomatic relations with Portugal as early as the 1480s, initially as equals. The Congo kings weren't conquered subjects. They were sovereign rulers who chose to engage with European traders and missionaries on their own terms. But by the 19th century, everything was about to change. Several factors converged in the 1880s to make the scramble for Africa inevitable. European factories were producing goods faster than ever before, but they needed two things: raw materials to feed their machines and new markets to sell their products. Africa offered both in abundance: rubber for tires, palm oil for soap and lubricants, gold, copper, diamonds, and millions of potential consumers. When the Suez Canal opened in 1869, it revolutionized trade with Asia. Suddenly, controlling African territory wasn't just about African resources. It was about securing the sea routes that connected Europe to its Asian colonies. When Britain occupied Egypt in 1882, other European powers realized they were falling behind in the race for strategic positions. This is crucial to understand. Europeans didn't conquer Africa through superior numbers or strategy alone. They had machine guns. The Maxim gun, invented in 1884, could fire 500 rounds per minute. African armies, no matter how brave or well organized, simply couldn't compete with this technology. As one British officer famously put it, "Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and they have not." Europeans convinced themselves they were bringing civilization to Africa through Christianity and trade. This wasn't just propaganda. Many genuinely believed they were performing a moral duty. This self-righteousness made the conquest psychologically easier to justify. In 1884, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck called a conference in Berlin. Officially, it was about establishing free trade in Africa and preventing European wars over African territory. In reality, it was about dividing up Africa as efficiently as possible. Here's who was invited: Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Austria, Hungary, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Netherlands, Russia, Turkey, and the United States. Notice anyone missing? That's right. Not a single African representative was invited to discuss the future of their own continent. The conference established the principle of effective occupation. You could only claim African territory if you could prove you actually controlled it. This sounds reasonable until you realize what control meant. A handful of European officials, some local collaborators, and a few machine guns were considered sufficient to claim sovereignty over millions of people. Perhaps the most shocking outcome was giving King Leopold II of Belgium personal control over the Congo Free State, an area 76 times larger than Belgium itself. This wasn't even Belgian territory, it was Leopold's private property. The conference delegates actually believed Leopold's promises about free trade and humanitarian work. The reality was one of history's worst genocides, with an estimated 10 million Congolese dying under Leopold's brutal rubber extraction system. The Berlin Conference created borders that were geographic and political disasters. The new borders completely ignored African ethnic, linguistic, and cultural boundaries. The Yoruba people were divided between Nigeria and Benin. The Somali people were split across 5 different colonies. Families found themselves separated by international borders that existed only on European maps. Conversely, groups that had been historical rivals were suddenly forced into the same colonies. Nigeria, for example, combined the predominantly Muslim north with the largely Christian south, groups with completely different languages, religions, and political systems. The borders made no economic sense either. Landlocked countries were cut off from their traditional trade routes. River systems were divided between multiple colonies, making navigation and trade unnecessarily complicated. Here's what most people don't know. Africans didn't just passively accept European conquest. There was massive resistance across the continent. Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia, then called Abyssinia, played European powers against each other brilliantly. He acquired modern weapons from France, Britain, and Russia, then used them to crush an Italian invasion at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. Ethiopia remained independent, proving that European conquest wasn't inevitable. It required specific circumstances and African disunity. In South Africa, Dutch settlers, Boers, fought 2 wars against British expansion. Using guerrilla tactics and superior marksmanship, they initially held off the British Empire. The British eventually won, but only by using concentration camps and scorched earth tactics that killed thousands of civilians. Across Africa, local leaders fought European conquest. Most failed due to technological disadvantages, but their resistance was real and often prolonged. The Berlin Conference wasn't just about political control. It was about creating a system of economic extraction that would benefit Europe for decades. African colonies were forced to export raw materials to European factories, then buy back finished products at inflated prices. This prevented African industrialization and kept the continent economically dependent. Whether through direct slavery, taxation that forced people into wage labor, or outright coercion, European colonies extracted African labor on a massive scale. The Congo's rubber quotas, South Africa's mining compounds, and forced cotton cultivation across West Africa all relied on various forms of forced labor. Railways, ports, and roads were built not to benefit Africans, but to move resources from the interior to European markets. This infrastructure pattern still shapes African economies today. The Berlin Conference's effects didn't end with independence in the 1960s. Many African conflicts today stem from the artificial borders created in Berlin. Civil wars in Nigeria, Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, and elsewhere often follow the ethnic and religious divisions that European borders ignored. The colonial economic system of exporting raw materials and importing finished goods persists today. Most African countries still rely heavily on exporting unprocessed natural resources rather than developing their own industries. Colonial governments were designed to extract resources, not serve African populations. When independence came, many countries inherited weak, illegitimate institutions that struggled to govern effectively. By 1914, just 30 years after the Berlin Conference, 90% of Africa was under European control. Only Ethiopia and Liberia remained independent. 7 European countries controlled an entire continent. Millions of Africans had died from violence, disease, and exploitation. The Berlin Conference wasn't just a historical curiosity. It was one of the most consequential meetings in human history. In 4 months, 14 European men redrew the map of an entire continent, affecting hundreds of millions of people who had no say in their own fate. The conference revealed the ugly truth about European civilization. It was built on the systematic exploitation of other peoples. The same countries that preached about human rights and democracy at home were carving up Africa like a Christmas turkey. But perhaps most importantly, the Berlin Conference shows us how quickly the world can change when powerful interests align. The speed with which Africa was conquered, most of it in just 20 years, demonstrates that historical change isn't always gradual. Sometimes a few men in a room can reshape the world. Today, as we watch new powers compete for influence in Africa, China's Belt and Road Initiative, American military bases, European trade agreements, we should remember the lessons of Berlin. Are we witnessing a new scramble for Africa? And this time, will African voices be heard? What do you think? Are the parallels between 1884 and today real, or are we looking at a fundamentally different situation? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the historical events that still shape our world today. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please check out our playlists and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. See you next time.